Today's chapter is titled The Iberian Imperial Dawn. You might say we're finally here. We spent 3 chapters going into a preview. This is like the start of the class for real, like colonial Latin America. Who do we expect to show up first for Iberian Imperial Dawn? Who should be the first person we read about? We think we're going to read about, I guess that was his real name. He has so many names. Cristobal Colon, as he's known in the Spanish-speaking world, Christopher Columbus. Restall and Lane tried to convince us that his real name was Cristofero Colombo from Genoa. He was only wandering around. But we don't even start with him. Who do we start with? Pluto, some person I've never heard of. And you probably haven't either. And you probably don't remember his name because nobody knows his name. Ferdinand van Olmen. But you and I wanted to know more about this guy. Why? Why were we Wikipediaing this guy as soon as we could, but I couldn't even find him on Wikipedia. I had to go into Dutch Wikipedia. I don't even know, but some translated Wikipedia. He was missing. Yeah. He sails off. No, I was looking up this guy. Apparently he sails to the west. So we have so we talked about in the last house how the Portuguese were exploring islands off the coast of Africa. So they acquire the Madeira Islands and they start growing sugarcane there. Down we talked about the first sugar plantations proper in São Tomé, which were uninhabited. The Canary Islands, as we read about, were inhabited, and Spain and Portugal fight over them. Eventually, Spain takes them over and basically colonizes them as a template for later colonies. But apparently, this guy basically starts in the Azores and sails west. And from what I read about him, it was really interesting because how did he know to sail west from there? And apparently what had happened is they found driftwood on the westward side of some of these islands. And so they're like, if we're finding wood that's not coming from the east, it's coming from the west, there must be land over there. Must not be, so we'll just strike off and see. And apparently he never came back. Or we'd be calling this the Olmenia, the continent of Olmenia. Now, however, if you read more about this guy, it's actually unclear if he ever went or if he was simply called back to Portugal and maybe didn't go at all. So, it's kind of iffy. They're more confident historians than Dutch Wikipedia is about him. But anyway, we don't know that much about him. He seems to have disappeared from the historical record if he was ever there. But the point is that there are lots of Portuguese and Spanish explorers kind of plunking around, including this guy, Pedro Alvarez Cabral. What happens to Cabral, Ryan? He gets blown off course and he discovers Brazil in the year 1500. So here he's trying to do the same thing, remember, and he does. He just takes a little bit longer. He's rounding the Cape of Good Hope to get to India. And he gets blown off and plunks down on Brazil. Now, what's interesting here is if there had never been a Columbus, this guy would have basically discovered the whole place. And in fact, he knew more about this place than Columbus did. So he starts sailing down. He initially thought it was an island, and they started sailing down the coast. You can see their route here. And they're like, oh, this is a big, big island. And he actually started to think, hey, wait a second. We're not in Asia, and this is big. I think we might have had a new continent. So he sails on this way, but he dispatched a ship back to the king to say, hey, we got something here. So basically, he did know about it. And in fact, Liam, they said something about this guy, that famous merchant who was apparently more famous than Columbus, but we've never heard of him. He's the one who coined the phrase, New world. He's discovered a new world, which apparently is. So again, a lot of people get down on Columbus. The whole film was getting down on Columbus. A lot of people want to beat up on Columbus. But if it hadn't been Columbus, it would have been. And in fact, it was somebody else. And in fact, Cabral basically did it inadvertently. So they would have bumped into it. And they did somehow. And then here we start off with the colonization process. Now, one of the few weird things about this is the fact that Portugal, that little tiny little place on the edge of Europe, becomes this huge empire. In fact, my daughter a couple nights ago watched the movie Mystic Pizza, where they're talking about being Portuguese in Connecticut. I don't know if any of you, are there any stereotypes about the Portuguese in the Northeast? Does this ring a bell? They were stereotyped as like sort of working class and too Catholic. And so they're kind of the downtrodden party, so it's interesting because in like sort of Portuguese mythology, they're like the underdeveloped, downtrodden working class people. But actually, they're like the beginnings of a global empire. Now, as you guys wrote, they had limited resources. They only have that tiny little strip of land, and they have the handy coastline, which means that they can, several of you noted, they are looking outward. So it seems like it's one of those paradoxes of history, because they didn't have very much land and because they were very coastal sailing type peoples, they were traders from before. Very important point. I mean, we're not, like we said, we're not really dealing with countries here. We're not dealing with the country of Spain. We're dealing with these, city states and kingdoms.
Portugal's larger than a city.
Yeah, Portugal is actually one of the first kind of consolidated countries because they do the Reconquista and they become like a sort of they probably are one of the first instances of sort of European nationalism. But there's a lot of different people contributing this. And of course, Columbus is Genoan, as it said, Venetians, people wanting in on this trade. So it's not just the Portuguese. And of course, there's Columbus hanging around Lisbon trying to get funded. He wanted in on the Portuguese thing too, right? He wanted to sail with the Portuguese because they were where everything was at. Everything was going on. But poor Columbus, he had no social connections. He didn't marry the right people. He didn't have an audience with the people. Columbus was pretty mad about his fate his whole life. He never thought he always thought he was getting a raw deal. And there was something else about Columbus. He's trying to sell this idea, and what do the Portuguese think of his idea of the world? Yeah.
Shaped like a pear.
Shaped like a pear. Yeah, I know. He had what they called a skewed sense of global geography. It's like, no, I swear, I'm getting there. I'm gonna just sail west. I'll be there. Come on, guys, give me some money. Give me some people. Yeah, he sort of thought it was smaller. The pear thing I hadn't heard about. That is skewed.
Even for that time, that's pretty insane.
Yeah, so he was a little nuts, but
he may be a flat earther today. Oh, absolutely.
But luckily, Noah, he had some buddies who were probably equally insane or equally aggrieved. Who are the people who are willing to support this guy?
He also said he saw mermaids, though. Like, he was like definitely like suffering from the scurvy.
Yeah, he probably went.
From his description, they were walruses or something like that. But he was like, yeah, wow, they're kind of hairy and creepy looking. But
we can't believe much of what he said.
Yeah.
So Noah, who's on his side? The Castilian. So remember Castile, they're those landlocked people who are expanding and they're kind of pretty intolerant. And they're like, yeah, we too have been aggrieved. We too do not have the adequate social connections. We want to have an empire too, like the Portuguese. And so they fund him, as Restall and Lane say. They shared his frustration and they met and they were able to be put together. So Restall and Lane on page 61 say that in 1492, there were 4 crucial events Ryan, later in the chapter on page 68, they talk about these as the watershed events of 1492. But they're really referring back to what they said on page 61. So that's the answer to this question of what were these sort of world-changing, you might say, events, the watershed events, the places where the water runs to both sides of a mountain. So the first we knew about, the fall of the Muslim kingdom of Granada, the last Muslim caliphate on the peninsula. Marks the expulsion basically of the Muslims from Spain. Castilians get control of those Canary Islands. So they are able to colonize them to basically, and that becomes their model, another model, as well as Granada, of expanding and acquiring new territories, what to do. The expulsion of the Jews also from the peninsula. Convert or die or leave is basically the choice that they are given, if that is a choice. And so this is the marking of this, again, this rise of a militant Catholic nationalism, which makes it, we go from this relative home vivencia, right, living together, to no, we will not be living together. We will be a Christian country. We're expelling people who don't believe this. And the fourth one, which most people think of first, of course, is that Columbus, actually, it's interesting, he goes and meets with Queen Isabella in Granada itself. So it's an interesting little crossover here. And he gets sponsorship to go sail off. Columbus goes off in search of Asia and tries to convince everybody that he has hit the Indies. He does not land in Florida. He eventually sets up his first spot of a colony is La Isabella, named after the queen that he liked so much and that liked him enough to send him over there. And they say that this is on the island of Hispaniola. So we know this today as the island that contains Haiti, which was once the French colony of Saint-Domingue, and the Dominican Republic, related of San Domingo. But at the time, it was called Hispaniola, island of Hispaniola. And he sets up a colony here, and he sets up a house, and he does all kinds of things there. It's interesting here. We often think that the Spanish just went in and colonized the whole place very quickly, but as Restall and Lane describe it, their first things were basically failures. He tried to get, as we saw in the film, he tried to get them to give him gold, but they didn't have very much gold. When he tried to do different things with them, it didn't work out that well, because unlike some of the African kingdoms, they were not interested in these sort of commodities. They did not have a history of being enslaved or these kinds of things. And so it didn't work out, even though he brought a lot of people with him from Spain. And in fact, he became exiled himself from the Indies. So he was able to do some other stuff, but he basically gets kicked out. And people really, he becomes relatively minor player. He becomes basically forgotten for a few hundred years after that. He wasn't seen as playing the hugest role of his time. I mean, he had his fame, but he wasn't such a big deal after that. So that was a failure. They mentioned on page 64 that the Portuguese, they also they weren't that interested in colonization, but they at least wanted to get these Brazil wood, Pau Brazil, which they wanted apparently for the dye that's in it, that could make things, could stain them. And I looked this up. It's apparently still used for violin bows. For people who really want the best violin bow, get this legally or illegally. Yeah, James.
I just was gonna say, doesn't Brazil now speak more Portuguese than Portugal?
I think that is true. I think there are more Portuguese speakers in Brazil than there are.
Yeah, it's a weird thing.
For sure.
By many times over.
Yeah, right.
Brazil's a large country.
Yeah. No, Brazil's huge. And so, yeah, in terms of now, I'm not sure that, well, if you saw in the film, for those of you who speak Spanish, there's like there's Latin American Spanish and there's Spanish, and those guys are coming. There's this kind of bridge, and then of course in the film they're also speaking Quechua, and same thing in Brazil. There's Portuguese, and then there's Brazilian Portuguese, and there's obviously they're very related, and you can translate back and forth, or you can talk back and forth, but it's not exactly the same thing. But anyway, yeah.
It feels a bit strange to me to think about how, like, in a lot of Latin American countries, unfortunately, a lot of people discriminate against like native languages the same way we would towards Spanish.
Yeah, no, there's a lot. I mean, it was the original colonial model. I mean, in some ways, it was like, as they say, well, as I said in the movies, speak Christian, speak to me in Christian, or speak Spanish, or speak Castellano, and they would try to eliminate various indigenous languages. And so again, in the film, you see this sort of, a few layers of colonialism. So you see the Bolivian officials who are, they're in the government, they're like, they equally have discriminatory attitudes toward their own indigenous population. So yeah, I mean, this becomes a kind of perpetuating thing. So our textbook in this chapter takes us basically, up until about, say, 1520, from 1492 with Columbus, and then with the Portuguese in Brazil, in the Caribbean and Brazil. They have this model that they learned from medieval times, which they used in Grenada and on the Canary Islands, where you convert them to Christianity. So in the film, you make sure they're all being Christian, and that they pay tribute, some form of taxes to you. But as our textbook says, that La Isabella failed, and then when they tried to do this other thing, it failed too, because the indigenous people were not interested in producing commodities for the crown. And so a lot of these islands and the coast of Brazil became pretty depopulated, both because of the harshness of Spanish tactics and the new diseases that we'll talk about. And so in some of these places, that's where they began importing enslaved Africans in order to replace the people who had perished, who had died in these places, and beginning to start different kinds of things. But in this time period, there really weren't any huge successes. You could say, oh, we're really getting a lot of money out of this, or we really got a lot of resources out of this. It actually was, in some ways, a sideshow to what was going on more along the African coast and what they were still getting from India and Asia. And so our textbook says that after 1500, there's a divergence here. The Spaniards, who are now becoming more, we could call them more Spaniards, start to, from the Caribbean, concentrate on the mainland of America. We'll be reading about in the next couple of chapters how they began to explore the rest of the continent. And the Portuguese are still they are much more interested in their trade with Asia, in controlling the trade of enslaved Africans. And it says that they are slowly starting to grow their sugar plantations in Brazil, but mainly because they're worried about the French. And so the French are prowling around there. Our textbook calls the French a serious nuisance. So the Portuguese are getting annoyed because the French are also starting to get interested in these places. And so the Portuguese then have to try and ward them off. So some of you asked, like, well, what's going on here? What's going on with the French? And eventually we will see in the Americas, we'll see some non-Latin American players. We see the French, which are still classified as Latin American, but we see the English, the Dutch, even the Danes, and they get involved, but they have a slightly later start than the Spanish and the Portuguese. So the Portuguese and the Spanish are there first, and they are exploring first, and they have better navigation at first. But some of these areas, especially in the Caribbean, would become very fought over and very contested and would change hands several times before they kind of settle into a more colonial system. So the Portuguese and the Spanish had a head start, and they had and they also had a head start on what we might call the religious nationalism side, right? I mean, in some ways, the English and the French are still kind of they're not as consolidated. I believe, you know, there's sort of Protestants versus Catholics still in England, for example. And the Pope had sanctioned the Portuguese and the Spanish and divided up the world. And, you know, the French were Catholics, so they were supposed to obey the Pope as well. Pluto, you found this kind of curious. And what's the Pope's doing? Was the Pope sound more like what's the Pope doing here? This is going to be, again, we're not entirely dealing with countries here, right? We're not dealing with with leaders of nations. And so a lot of people considered that their ultimate leader was the church or the Pope. And the Pope said, hey, the Portuguese get this part of the world and the Spanish get the other part, and basically sanctions this as exploration and conquest. And, you know, I don't know if the French cared what the Pope said, but they probably did. I mean, they were Catholic too, and there were lots of debates. And of course, this comes up about who's going to be Protestant, who's going to respect the Pope, and all of those kinds of things. So the English would become a nuisance as well, and there'd be various fights about this. But part of it has to do with the influence of state or government control versus religious authority. Now, there were some Catholics, as we saw in the film, some Catholics did protest this. One of the most famous is Bartolome de las Casas, who was there was actually running a plantation, but found himself increasingly against this and wrote this very famous book in defense of the defense of the Indians, and was basically trying to promote the cause of natives there. The film is actually accurate in the sense, and it echoes what we saw in the textbook. You can see the guy who played Christopher Columbus is like, yeah, but he still believed that they should be under Spanish control. He wasn't really a radical in that sense. The other thing is that Las Casas becomes famous not just because he's within Spain and everybody loved him, but or hated him, but the English liked what he said because it seemed like he was anti-Spanish. Remember, the English are becoming a nuisance here too, and so they kind of would encourage this sort of thinking and publish it themselves. And it contributes to what Restall and Lane in this section call the Black Legend. The Black Legend, you may have heard of the Black Legend. If I got anything on this. The Black Legend is basically the idea that especially the Spanish, because that's who the English knew the best, were sort of these terrible, rapacious, awful people, and just, you know, they just devastated the indigenous people. And so this became the idea that Spanish colonialism was much more brutal than, say, English colonialism, Anglo colonialism. Now, here's a good question for you, since you've never heard of the Black Legend, but it's actually, where do you think the idea of the Black Legend, that the Spanish were particularly awful and brutal and terrible, where has that been the strongest? Who liked that idea the most? Who promoted the idea of how bad the Spanish were? Obviously, the English, we know a little bit about that because they wanted their own colonial control. They wanted to get Jamaica and all these things, but who else would like this legend?
Anyone who was anti-Catholic?
Anyone who was anti-Catholic. So there, yeah, it definitely reverberated within Protestant countries, the idea of, oh yeah, we're better than those Catholics. It plays a particular role in our own US history in the 19th century. So when the United States went to war with Mexico and went to war with Spain and got Puerto Rico and acquired the Philippines, they basically got ginned up on this idea that the Spanish were particularly terrible, and we, the United States, are going to be nice to people in this region. So it actually persists with us to this day, the idea that there was sort of this brutal Spanish colonialism and that the Anglos weren't so bad, were pretty good. And so, it's interesting that it's, they republished Bartolome. Why would they want to republish that like 400 years after the fact? It's, again, it's supporting our own myths of nationhood. Yeah.
You ever read Huckleberry Finn?
Have
Because
I read
I'm
Huckleberry
thinking-
Finn?
That reminds me, because I know there was a huge section of the book dedicated to like a trial scene about like a Spaniard accusing of like killing someone. And I'm pretty sure it definitely played into like those stereotypes a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not up on my Huck Finn, but yeah, these were the kinds of things that, these sort of stereotypes about, how people were in the Southwest and how they needed to be, under this rule of the they'd be better off under our jurisdiction. So yeah, it's been pretty strong here. There's another sort of United Statesian question. Remember how Columbus was forgotten for, there was no Columbus Day. Nobody cared. He was kind of a failure. Everybody celebrated other things, but Columbus, I mean, it's not that people didn't know about him, but they certainly didn't make it a holiday. Anybody know who would want to make Columbus into a hero? Mostly because there was an alliance between the Irish Catholics and the Italian Catholics in the United States, and they'd have this Knights of Columbus, and they'd have these big parades, and they convinced Roosevelt to call it a national holiday. And it was key because remember that Catholics in the United States were accused of being too loyal to the Pope. Even as late as Kennedy's election in 1960, people were like, no, we can't elect him. He's has more allegiance to the Pope than he does to his country. So this was the accusation against Catholics. So for Irish people and for Italian people, Columbus was seen as this person that they could exalt as a person of civic nationhood. It's basically, for those of you who are with me in cultural anthropology, it's basically one of the ways in which the Irish and Italians become white in this country. It's by boosting their Columbusness, and that's probably why they get mad when you try and change the holiday around. It also helped that Spain had fallen down on its luck, and so in 1892 they were trying to celebrate 400 years of this discovery and boost their nationalism again. So it's this curious thing that Columbus wasn't a big deal, but he becomes a big deal later on in our century. Around these kinds of issues. Now, in 1892, as you can see, Columbus was being celebrated, celebrating the 400 years of this wonderful encounter. Columbus Day gets instituted. By 1992, people were asking different questions about this. Pluto said it was much too late. They should have realized this a long time ago. And certain people did. But by 1992, people were like, wait a second, this was a Holocaust, which was a term, applied to what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany and in Europe. Should we apply the same term, a genocide or a Holocaust, to the devastation that was wrought on the Americas? By the way, these terms are being debated right now, right? What constitutes a genocide, for example? But this was, people talking about this. Now, on the one hand, there was definitely the enslavement of indigenous people that occurred, and there were all sorts of terrible things that were done. The scene from the movie is not is accurate in the sense there was lots of that, and they wanted people to labor for them. They wanted people, but our authors say, well, Josie, what did they want to kill all these people? Were they intentionally doing this?
Well, they wanted the labor out of them, and if they're all dead, you can't really use them for labor.
Yeah, no, they didn't want to.
I think a good comparison is probably the Irish potato famine, because there's a lot of debate as well about whether the Irish potato famine was a genocide as well. Because the British colonized Ireland and caused through negligence, basically caused millions of Irish people to die. So I'd say it's a combination of negligence and wanting their labor for free, not necessarily wanting to kill all of them.
Yeah, so I mean, again, there's debate about this. We
It's not
can't
really,
yeah.
I mean, it's obviously horrible, but I wouldn't really say it's necessarily a genocide because that wasn't their goal. Like, to me, a genocide is more like a deliberate goal to kill every single person in a specific group.
Yeah, so that's part of the debate, right? Do you have to have intent in order to make it a genocide? And they didn't want to because they still wanted them working for them. They wanted tribute. That's worse, says Lynn. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Well, anyway, that's sort of part of the scope of the debate. Now, what did Spain do? On the advice of Las Casas and others, they did ban the enslavement of indigenous or native people. So they said you can't enslave.
Later, though.
Later, yeah, not at first. This is later, but they're fairly early on. 1502, I think, was the first, and 1530s. Yeah, and then validated again. But there were lots of exceptions, right? It's like if they were fighting against you, for example, then there was fair game. It's like if you were in a rebellion, you could be enslaved. So, it's like it's this kind of, you sort of send some people in there that look like they're going to enslave you. And then when the people get upset, then you enslave them because like they were fighting us. Look, fair game, fair game. So there are lots of exceptions, and there was lots of, just because it's illegal doesn't mean people don't do it. I mean, I know in college, you guys all follow the laws to the letter. If it's illegal, you would never do it. Same thing here, right? Legal as that. And as you see in the movie, because, I mean, Las Casas, and again, the movie people are right. He did say, hey, why don't we bring in Africa? Or, I mean, why don't we increase the African trade? He also did regret it. So, but it did, I mean, because of the need for labor, it does sort of keep doing the African enslavement. So was it a Holocaust? Was it a genocide? Does it have to be deliberate in order to do it? One of the things your authors point to is what Las Casas and others did not understand at the time. And we finally know all the things about epidemic disease because we all follow the science on this at every turn now, is that the epidemic diseases like smallpox were very crucial in the demise of the native population. So people didn't really understand how epidemic diseases spread and the role of viruses and resistance. And in the native peoples in the indigenous Americas, because they did not have much experience or any experience with the large domesticated animals, which is where we get most of these diseases from, like smallpox and the plague and all those things, are mainly because of our closeness with domesticated animals. And so throughout Eurasia and throughout Africa, it's not like they didn't die from smallpox. They did, but over the generations, they had more resistance to it. They also knew what to do if smallpox was on the way to your town. What do you do if smallpox is coming in? So you see it coming to the next town. You know that there's about to be some smallpox. What do you do? Huh? you seal off the town.
Okay.
You isolate yourselves, you burn up, you like, and if anybody has it, you don't go visit them, right? You don't take care of them because you're afraid of it. And so the Europeans had this mentality sort of from a long time ago. Whereas for the indigenous Americans, if you were sick, you had to take care of the person, right? Which ends up spreading the disease. So part of it is a lack of resistances and a lack of familiarity with how diseases work. But I have to say that the harsh laboring conditions into which many and the displacement and all these things exacerbated the spread of disease. So it isn't like it was completely, and we know this in fact, because a lot of these disease waves didn't come immediately. They would come 20 or 30 or even 100 years later, would sweep through some of these places. So it couldn't have just been lack of resistance. It had to be some other social factors. So, yeah.
Something really interesting I read in 1491 was although that indigenous people in the Americas didn't have a lack of resistance to like diseases and stuff, they had pretty much near immunity because of their gene pool being similar to many genetic conditions, such as I believe hemophilia and like various cognitive and developmental disorders, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's, there probably are trade-offs there, right?
Yeah.
In this case, smallpox was probably, because it was contagious, was pretty effective as a weapon. Now, this is my kind of take on this. I think that it is not debatable that whether we want to call it a genocide or not, the consequences of it were genocidal in terms of the vast decline of people in the Americas. And so, it may not have been deliberate, but it was a huge demographic event. So we have the Iberian invasion of the Americas, and we have the transatlantic enslavement of Africans have enormous demographic consequences, which it's hard not to say were basically aimed at the two continents, were in many cases kind of depopulating them. And some scientists believe that we can trace what the geological epoch known as the Anthropocene to the year 1610. And basically, this is the year that people debate, like, when is it that the impact of human beings is the most important impact on the climate of the world, right? And so some people say, oh, it's in 1950 with the atomic testing. Some people say it's with the Industrial Revolution. But some people say it was in 1610 because of the depopulation of some of these areas. You can see the forests, basically there's a drop in global temperatures, which is registered all over the world. Some people say it's perhaps the source of what is called the Little Ice Age. So because of these massive demographic population times that happened between 1500 to 1600, you have this huge, again, demographic, but also perhaps a first instance of like global climate being affected by human behavior. So we have started off with the Iberian Imperial Dawn, which up until now is not very, I don't know, it sounds more scary than promising when you have dawn. And so they've done some stuff. They're hanging out in the Caribbean and on the coast of Brazil. But in the next chapter, we're going to go back into the Inca and the Aztec Empire, which at this time are themselves expanding, even though the Spanish and the Portuguese are off doing their thing. They haven't met each other yet.